This is History of Sexuality in the U.S. Lecture 4C, Part 5, talking about the rumbles of discontent that we can hear in the late 1950s and early 1960s if we just listen close enough. Though the 1950s and early 60s are seen as this profoundly conformist era, where those cheerful robots seem to run the show, and that vision of Eisenhower's America seemed to predominate, what we see when we look closer are a lot of ways in which the movements of the 1960s and 70s that are going to enormously change the society are already starting to appear in a number of ways in the historical record. One of the most important here is the Black Freedom Movement. And it's important for us to understand that both the Civil Rights Movement and the Black Power Movement were grounded in particular experiences of gender and sexuality. Rosa Parks, who famously sets off the Montgomery bus boycott that brings Martin Luther King Jr. to national attention, began her political work working for the NAACP in the South, traveling around and investigating sexual assaults of black women by white men that went unpunished by the law. So we want to understand that the rumbles that start this movement and get it organized and get it to start thinking regionally have a lot to do with trying to prevent sexual violence and respond to it. Similarly, the women's liberation movement that begins to grow early in the 1960s focuses on the way that issues that are often talked about in this moment as interpersonal are actually about collective distributions of power, and that arguments over who's going to do the dishes or who's going to take care of the kids aren't really about a problem within a couple, but are rather about the systematic distribution of labor and the way that men have lowered expectations for contributions in the home, whereas women are expected to take on this work naturally and without complaint. One of the greatest articulations of this malaise, of this way in which, despite living supposedly in the wealthiest and most satisfying society ever, middle-class, educated white women were deeply discontent at this moment. And a lot of that is summed up in Betty Friedan's Feminine Mystique, which takes the viewpoint of a very privileged person, but asks a legitimate question. With all this privilege, why are these wealthy housewives still so unhappy? Another group that was very unhappy at the time and expressed discontent with this moment were the Beat poets, or the Beat movement. They were people who literally said, "We're beat. This generation is tired, and we don't have that same sense of purpose and that sense of hope that the World War II generation had." Rather, they could see in the 1950s that conformist culture was suffocating. And a big way that beats like Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg spoke out against the order was to speak of their ideas about unrestrained sexuality, and the way that this middle-class conformist society denied the body and denied sexuality in many ways. Students and young people, especially as those baby boomers start to turn into adults. And remember, the first baby boomers are turning 18 in the early 60s. As we start to see more and more youth taking up a greater and greater proportion of the population, they're demanding more respect and more power. And that environment of conformity is one in which the TV show Father Knows Best sums up the ideology in its title. It's all about the authority. Older people tell younger people what to do, and there can be no questioning of it. The 1960s, as this massive baby boom starts to come into their teenage adolescence, are really going to question that wisdom in a number of ways. Another important group questioning the wisdom of the time is the homophile movement, who are facing a great amount of repression, even attempting to communicate with each other. For many early gay and lesbian groups, even sending simple publications with just text communicating about your political purpose, if it was related to sexuality, could be ruled as something obscene. It meant that homophiles organize in a really constrained environment until we start to see an opening up caused by the free speech movement. Homophile organizations win a really important case called One Incorporated versus US. And One Incorporated was one of the most important homophile magazines. What you have, though, as your document is an even more significant free speech case because it's going to be used to decide 1 versus US. And that is Roth versus US. Samuel Roth was a publisher of a magazine dedicated to love called American Aphrodite. You might say that American Aphrodite, by contemporary standards, is raunchy, but very questionably obscene. He took this all the way to the Supreme Court, who for many decades had used what was called the Hicklin test. The Hicklin test said you need to look at a piece of material and think about the most vulnerable person in the community. Would they be offended or hurt by exposure to it? And it meant a really strict standard that almost anything could be labeled obscene if you use the Hicklin test. The Hicklin test in 1957 is replaced with the Roth test, a much more complicated idea that's going to be taken up again in further free speech cases in the 1960s and 70s. Take a look at that and the 3 other legal documents you have as you go over to Discussion 4C and complete today's session. Have a great day, and I'll talk to you soon.